There is a particular quality of light in the Caribbean that makes everything look like a promise. The water turns colors that have no proper names in any honest language. Not quite turquoise, not quite emerald, but something between the two that speaks directly to the part of the human brain that confuses beauty with truth. The palm trees bend in the trade winds with a kind of practiced elegance, as though they have learned over centuries the art of appearing effortless. The air carries salt and sweetness in equal measure, and somewhere in all of that impossible beauty, in that intoxicating theater of light and warmth and possibility, a fraud of almost incomprehensible scale was quietly, methodically, and quite cheerfully assembled over the course of 2 decades. The island of Antigua sits in the northeastern Caribbean like a jewel that does not quite belong to anyone. Its colonial past is written into its architecture, into the names of its streets, into the particular way that money moves through it, easily, quietly, leaving few traces behind. It was, by any reasonable measure, a perfect place to build something that was not meant to be examined too closely. And it was here, on this island of dissolving histories and convenient arrangements, that a man named Robert Allen Stanford chose to plant his flag. Stanford was born in Mejia, Texas, in 1950, a town whose very name carries the weight of obscurity, a place that exists at the margins of the American imagination, a flat and sun-baked corner of a state that has always understood the relationship between ambition and scale. His grandfather had run a small insurance company. His father had run a small insurance company. And Allen Stanford, in the logic of family mythology, would run an insurance company too. But Allen Stanford did not think small. Allen Stanford had looked at the horizon and decided, with the particular confidence of a man who has never been adequately questioned, that the horizon was merely a starting point. He studied finance at Baylor University, a Baptist institution in Waco, Texas, where the culture of moral certainty ran as deep as the foundations. He failed in real estate in the 1980s, when the Texas oil boom collapsed and took with it an entire landscape of paper fortunes. This failure is important to understand. It is important because failure, for some men, is a recalibration, a moment of honest reckoning with the limits of appetite. And for other men, failure is merely an education in concealment. Stanford emerged from the wreckage of his first financial collapse, not chastened, but educated, not humbled, but sharpened, understanding now that the fundamental vulnerability of any scheme was not the scheme itself, but the auditor who might one day arrive to examine it. He went to the Caribbean. This detail is not incidental. The Caribbean has functioned for centuries as a theater of reinvention, a place where Europeans arrived with nothing but nerve and left with fortunes extracted from the earth and from other human beings. The tradition of the self-made man in the Caribbean is inseparable from the tradition of exploitation, of regulatory arbitrage, of the careful cultivation of relationships with governments that have learned to value foreign investment over foreign scrutiny. Stanford understood this tradition intuitively. He set up a bank in Montserrat initially, then moved his operation to Antigua, where he found in the government a willing partner in the architecture of his ambitions. Stanford International Bank Limited. The name itself is a kind of performance, each word chosen for the weight of institutional legitimacy it carries. Stanford, a name that would come to carry its own authority. International, suggesting a reach that transcends the provincial. Bank, the oldest word in the language of trust. Limited, the one honest word in the title, though not in the way it was intended. The bank was incorporated in Antigua and operated under the supervision of the Financial Services Regulatory Commission of Antigua and Barbuda, a regulatory body that would later be revealed to have been not so much a watchdog as a decorative element, a piece of institutional furniture arranged to create the impression of oversight without the inconvenience of exercising it. The product that Stanford sold was, in its essence, beautifully simple. He offered certificates of deposit, CDs, at interest rates that were consistently, almost defiantly, higher than anything available at legitimate American banks. In the early 2000s, when American CDs were paying 3 or 4% annually, Stanford's bank was offering 8 or 9%. Later, as American rates fell even further, Stanford continued to promise returns that seemed, to the credulous eye, like evidence of extraordinary investment acumen, and that seemed, to the more skeptical eye, like evidence of something else entirely. The certificates were sold primarily through Stanford Financial Group, headquartered in Houston, Texas, with offices across the southern United States, Latin America, and beyond. Financial advisors, thousands of them, carried the product to their clients with the enthusiasm of true believers, because many of them were true believers, and because the commissions were extraordinary. The clients who bought these certificates were not, in the main, reckless gamblers. They were doctors, dentists, retirees, small business owners, people who had spent their working lives accumulating modest fortunes and who now wanted those fortunes to grow at a rate that would make their retirements comfortable. They were people who had been educated by a lifetime of experience to trust institutions that looked like institutions, that had marble lobbies and glossy brochures, and financial advisors who wore good suits and spoke with the measured confidence of those who have access to knowledge unavailable to ordinary people. Stanford understood this psychology with the precision of a craftsman. His offices were designed to communicate permanence. His brochures were designed to communicate sophistication. He himself was designed, or had designed himself, to communicate mastery. Because Alan Stanford was not content to be merely a financier, he understood that the architecture of credibility required more than numbers on a page. It required a persona, a character so large and so thoroughly constructed that it would function as its own evidence of legitimacy. And so Stanford became Sir Alan Stanford after purchasing a knighthood from the government of Antigua and Barbuda in 2006, an honor that required only the willingness to invest substantially in the country's infrastructure and the understanding that certain Caribbean nations have learned to treat their ceremonial distinctions as tradable assets. The knighthood was not merely vanity. It was branding. It was the addition of a title that would appear in every news article, on every business card, in every introduction. A single syllable that implied centuries of accumulated distinction. He bought a fleet of aircraft. He built a compound on Antigua that consumed an entire hillside. He sponsored cricket tournaments. Specifically, he sponsored 2020 cricket with a fervor that bordered on evangelical, because cricket in the Caribbean and across South Asia and England carried with it associations of tradition, fair play, and gentlemanly conduct that were precisely the associations he wished to borrow. In 2008, he stood on the field at the Antigua Recreation Ground and presented the winning team of a tournament he had organized with a case containing $20 million in cash, actual physical banknotes, stacked and sealed, before television cameras and crowds of thousands. The image was spectacular and was designed to be spectacular. It was a piece of theater in which the central prop was the very substance of the fraud, money, visible and abundant, deployed as its own advertisement. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been watching Stanford for years. This is one of the more unsettling facts in the entire story, not because regulatory failure is unusual, but because the failure here was documented so thoroughly and so long before the collapse that it takes on the quality of a dream in which you can see the disaster approaching but cannot move. Robert Royer, an SEC examiner, had flagged Stanford's operation as a likely Ponzi scheme in 1997. 1997, more than a decade before the fraud unraveled. The examination noted the implausible returns, the lack of transparency about the underlying investments, the dependence on new investor money to sustain the payments to existing investors. Every element of the structure that would eventually collapse was identified and documented. And yet the investigation stalled, was transferred, was deprioritized, and ultimately was not pursued with the urgency that its findings demanded. The reasons for this institutional paralysis are complex and uncomfortable. There is the question of jurisdiction. Stanford operated offshore, which created genuine legal ambiguities about the SEC's authority. There is the question of resources. Regulatory agencies are perpetually underfunded relative to the industries they are meant to supervise. There is the question of political influence. Stanford was a prodigious donor to political campaigns on both sides of the American aisle, contributing millions of dollars to candidates and party committees, and cultivating relationships with legislators who sat on committees that oversaw financial regulation. And there is, perhaps, the simpler and more dispiriting question of institutional culture. The tendency of bureaucracies to find reasons not to act, to defer to higher authorities, to wait for cleaner evidence, to avoid the risk of being wrong about a man who presents himself with such magnificent certainty. Meanwhile, the scheme grew. By the time of its collapse in 2009, Stanford International Bank had collected approximately $7 billion from investors across the world, in the United States, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Panama, in Canada, in the United Kingdom. The Latin American investors were particularly significant. Wealthy families, business people, individuals who had chosen to park their money offshore precisely because their own countries offered insufficient stability or confidentiality, and who had trusted Stanford's bank because it appeared to offer both. Many of these investors would lose everything. Families that had spent generations building modest wealth would find that wealth gone in a matter of weeks, transformed into nothing by the ordinary mathematics of fraud. The mathematics that reveal, when the music finally stops, that there was never enough to go around. The money that Stanford took in was not invested in the diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and liquid assets that the bank's promotional materials described. This is the essential fact from which all other facts derive. The certificates of deposit were sold on the promise of returns generated by sophisticated investment strategies managed by a team of professionals operating under Stanford's direction. The reality was entirely different. The investments were concentrated in illiquid real estate, in Stanford's own private businesses, in a portfolio of bad decisions and self-dealing transactions that generated nothing like the returns being paid to investors. The gap between what the bank claimed to hold and what it actually held was vast, and grew vaster with each passing year, as new investor money was used to pay the returns promised to existing investors. The classical structure of a Ponzi scheme, named for Charles Ponzi, who operated a similar fraud in Boston in 1920, and who at least had the distinction of conducting his deception on a smaller scale over a shorter period with considerably less private aviation. James Davis was Stanford's chief financial officer, his college friend, his partner in the architecture of the fraud. Davis later testified, after cooperating with federal prosecutors, that he had known from the beginning that the numbers were fabricated, that the financial statements presented to auditors were constructed fictions, that the actual financial position of Stanford International Bank was, for essentially its entire existence, one of insolvency, the state of owing more than you possess, which is the financial equivalent of building a house on water. Davis would become a crucial witness for the prosecution, his testimony providing the interior view of the fraud that no external investigation could have produced. He would receive a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, a transaction that carries its own uncomfortable logic, the architecture of justice accommodating itself to the architecture of investigation. Laura Pendergast Holt was Stanford's chief investment officer, responsible for the investment portfolio that was supposed to justify the extraordinary returns. She appeared before SEC investigators in February 2009 and lied to them, a decision that would result in her own criminal charges, independent of the broader fraud. Her presence in the organization raises questions that are not easily answered. Questions about what it means to be responsible for investments that do not exist, to speak with professional authority about strategies that are not being executed, to put your name and your credentials on documents that describe a world that has been invented rather than discovered. The collapse, when it came, arrived as most financial collapses do, not suddenly, but gradually, and then all at once. The global financial crisis of 2008 had created a climate of anxiety in which investors everywhere were demanding liquidity, requesting redemptions, asking the questions that bull markets make easy to avoid. The Madoff scandal, which broke in December 2008, had put the word Ponzi into the mouths of financial journalists and had sharpened the scrutiny applied to any investment operation offering implausibly consistent returns. The SEC, under new pressure and new leadership, reopened its examination of Stanford in earnest. In January 2009, federal investigators arrived at Stanford's Houston offices. On February 17, 2009, the Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil complaint against Stanford, alleging what it called a massive, ongoing fraud. Federal agents simultaneously arrived at Stanford's offices across the country. The doors closed. The phones went quiet. The machinery of the fraud stopped. Stanford himself was not immediately arrested. He had, in the preceding weeks, been moving, from Houston to his compound on Antigua, from Antigua to various locations in the Caribbean and the American South, accompanied by a woman who was described variously as his companion and his girlfriend, moving through a landscape that had once been his domain and was now becoming unfamiliar to him, the territory contracting around him in the way that the world contracts around those who have been found out. He was located in Virginia, in a town called Fredericksburg, and was served with civil papers by the SEC. He was formally indicted on federal charges in June 2009 and arrested shortly thereafter. The man who had stood on a cricket field with $20 million in a case had been reduced by the ordinary mechanisms of justice to a defendant. The trial took place in Houston, Texas in 2012. It lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution built its case methodically, presenting the testimony of former employees, of investors who had lost their savings, of regulators who had finally arrived at conclusions that should have been reached years earlier. The defense argued that Stanford was a genuine businessman whose investments had been destroyed by the financial crisis, that the losses were the product of catastrophe rather than fraud, that the gap between assets and liabilities was the wound inflicted by the market rather than the wound inflicted by design. The jury did not believe this argument. They deliberated for 3 days and returned a verdict of guilty on 13 of 14 counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, obstruction of justice, money laundering. Stanford was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. He was 59 years old at the time of sentencing. The mathematics of the sentence were, in their own way, a kind of poetic statement, a number so far beyond the span of any human life that it functions not as a practical punishment, but as a declaration, an assertion by the court that what had been done was of a magnitude that ordinary units of time could not adequately measure. The receivership that followed the criminal proceedings was itself a vast and melancholy undertaking. A court-appointed receiver, Ralph Janvey, was charged with locating whatever assets remained of Stanford's empire and distributing them to the creditors, a category that included the $7 billion worth of defrauded investors and their rightful claims. What was found was a fraction of what had been taken. The real estate was illiquid and worth far less than Stanford had claimed. The private businesses were in disarray. The aircraft had to be sold. The compound on Antigua was appraised and eventually sold. The cricket franchise was dissolved. The glossy offices were vacated. The machinery of a life constructed entirely from other people's money was dismantled piece by piece. Each piece turned into whatever cash it could generate, the cash distributed in fractions, pennies on the dollar, the residue of ambition. The investors who lost money have received, through the receivership process and through various legal settlements and insurance claims, some portion of their losses, but only some. The Stanford Victims Coalition was formed to represent the interests of investors through the legal proceedings, and its existence is a reminder that behind the abstraction of $7 billion are actual human lives, actual people who planned retirements that will not happen, who made promises to their families that they can no longer keep, who trusted an institution because the institution had been designed to be trusted. The Latin American investors in particular faced challenges in recovering losses because the jurisdictional complexity of offshore fraud creates obstacles that compound the injury of the fraud itself. The government of Antigua and Barbuda faced its own reckoning. The relationship between Stanford and the island's government had been close, extraordinarily close, the kind of closeness that raises questions about the boundaries between public service and private accommodation. Stanford had employed thousands of Antiguans, had contributed to infrastructure projects, had made the island's name known in international cricket. His departure left a void that was economic, reputational, and something harder to define. The particular emptiness left when a patron reveals himself to have been a thief. The Financial Services Regulatory Commission, which had certified Stanford International Bank for years without performing meaningful due diligence, was itself an object of scrutiny. Its former Inspector General, Leroy King, was charged by American prosecutors with taking bribes from Stanford in exchange for providing advance warning of SEC inquiries and assuring Stanford of favorable regulatory treatment. King fought extradition for years. The case became a study in the friction between national sovereignty and international accountability, between the legitimate legal principle that countries control their own jurisdictions and the practical reality that offshore financial regulation, if it is captured by those it is meant to regulate, becomes indistinguishable from conspiracy. The Securities and Exchange Commission's own performance was examined in a report by its Inspector General, conducted in 2010. The report was damning in the methodical, bureaucratic way that government reports can be damning, not with the language of outrage, but with the language of documentation, which in its accumulation can be more devastating than any polemic. The report found that the SEC's Fort Worth office had repeatedly identified Stanford's operation as a likely Ponzi scheme beginning in 1997, and had repeatedly failed to open a formal investigation. It found evidence of influence and of institutional hesitation, of examinations that were downgraded, of recommendations that were not followed, of a culture in which the discomfort of pursuing a case against a wealthy and politically connected individual combined with genuine jurisdictional uncertainty to produce inaction. The report named names. It documented the careers of specific examiners and their decisions. It created a record of the kind of institutional failure that is not criminal in itself, but that enables criminal outcomes. The failure of oversight to function as oversight rather than as performance. Spencer Barish was the head of the Fort Worth SEC office during the years when Stanford's operation was being identified and not pursued. He later left the SEC and went into private practice as a securities lawyer. He applied on multiple occasions for permission to represent Alan Stanford as a private attorney, to defend, in other words, the man whose fraud he had declined to investigate while in public office. The SEC's ethics office denied these requests 3 times. On a 4th occasion, Barash apparently did not seek permission and did briefly represent Stanford in a legal matter. He was fined by the SEC and agreed to a censure. The circularity of this, the regulator becoming the defender, is not merely ironic. It is illustrative of a structural truth about financial regulation in America, that the people who understand the industry well enough to regulate it are precisely the people who are most attractive to the industry as employees or advocates, and that this constant movement between the public and private spheres creates relationships and incentives that can distort the application of regulatory authority in ways that are entirely legal and entirely corrosive. The question of political donations deserves its own examination. Stanford contributed to congressional campaigns and committees with the systematic generosity of a man who understood that, in American politics, access is purchased rather than granted. He contributed to Democrats and Republicans with an even-handedness that reflected not ideological commitment, but strategic calculation. The understanding that the people who sit on financial regulatory committees belong to both parties, and that the cultivation of goodwill is most effective when it does not appear partisan. When the fraud collapsed, many recipients of Stanford's donations, senators, congressmen, party committees, announced that they were donating those funds to charity or returning them, a gesture that is both admirable and insufficient, a response to the revelation of where the money came from that does nothing to address the question of what the money purchased. The precise nature of the relationship between Stanford's political contributions and the regulatory treatment of his operation has never been fully determined. This absence of determination is itself a fact worth noting. The fact that it is very difficult, in the American political system, to draw a clean line between legal political contributions and illegal corruption, between the generosity of a donor and the purchase of favorable treatment. Stanford was assaulted in prison in 2009 by another inmate, suffering injuries that included a broken nose and facial fractures. He claimed for a period that the assault had caused him memory loss, and that he was therefore unable to assist in his own defense, a claim that his lawyers raised in pretrial proceedings, and that was ultimately rejected by the court. Prison is a place that exists outside the carefully managed theater of a financial career, a place where the architecture of persona offers no protection, where the marble lobbies and the private aircraft and the knighthood become irrelevant, where the only currency is the kind that cannot be fabricated by the methods available to a financier. Whatever Alan Stanford's interior experience of incarceration has been, it remains unobservable and therefore unknowable. The story of Stanford sits in an interesting relationship to the story of Bernie Madoff, whose fraud was revealed in December 2008, months before Stanford's collapse. The two cases are often paired in popular memory, both having produced massive losses, both having revealed spectacular regulatory failure, both having demonstrated the particular vulnerability of investors to charismatic authority, combined with the trappings of institutional legitimacy. But there are important differences. Madoff operated in New York, at the center of the American financial world, among sophisticated investors including hedge funds and charitable foundations. Stanford operated at the margins, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, among investors who were, many of them, not financially sophisticated, who were trusting an institution that had been designed to look trustworthy in precisely the ways they had been taught to recognize. Madoff's fraud was larger in dollar terms. Stanford's fraud may have been, in human terms, more distributed in its devastation, touching more ordinary lives across a wider geography. The legacy of the Stanford affair is not primarily legal. The legal story has been resolved. The guilty verdict stands, the appeals have been exhausted, the sentence runs its course in a federal prison in Florida. The legacy is something harder and more durable. It lives in the gap between what financial regulation promises and what it delivers. It lives in the architecture of offshore financial centers that have been constructed over decades to facilitate the movement of money in ways that are intentionally difficult to trace. It lives in the psychology of trust, in the question of how ordinary people are supposed to evaluate the trustworthiness of institutions that have been professionally designed to appear trustworthy, that deploy the full vocabulary of legitimacy, that present credentials and testimonials and regulatory certifications that may have been purchased or fabricated or simply not examined. And it lives in the Caribbean light, which continues to fall on the island of Antigua with the same indifferent beauty that it has always possessed. The trade winds move through the palm trees with the same practiced elegance. The water continues to show its colors without names. The harbor where Stanford's yachts once anchored is still a harbor. The hillside where its compound stood has not forgotten its geometry, though the compound itself has been sold and repurposed and carries now a different set of claims upon it. The cricket ground where he stood with his case of banknotes has hosted other matches, other ceremonies, other moments of spectacle that belong to the legitimate commerce of sport. The island moves forward as islands do, carrying its history quietly, letting the light do what it has always done, which is to make everything look, at first glance, like a promise. What separates a promise from a lie is the intention behind it. This is not a philosophical abstraction, but a legal distinction and a human one. Stanford's certificates of deposit were promises. They used the language of promises, the instruments of promises, the institutional apparatus of promises. They were, in the determination of a jury of 12 people, lies from the beginning. Not promises that became impossible to keep, but lies designed to extract money from people who had learned to trust certain kinds of language and certain kinds of institutions. The $7 billion that passed through Stanford International Bank was not invested. It was consumed by Stanford's lifestyle, by his aircraft and his compounds and his cricket tournaments, by the payments to earlier investors that the Ponzi structure required, by the ordinary expenses of maintaining a fiction on an industrial scale. The people who lost their money are older now than they were. The retirements that were planned around those savings are being lived, or not being lived, in ways that were not chosen. The financial advisors who sold the certificates, many of whom believed in what they were selling, who had examined the available materials and concluded that the investment was sound, who had placed their own clients in an instrument that turned out to be a fabrication, have carried the weight of that experience in their professional lives. Some of them faced legal action, some faced regulatory sanction. Many faced simply the private burden of having recommended something that destroyed people's savings, a burden that does not diminish with the discovery that they too were deceived. The auditor of Stanford International Bank was a small firm in Antigua, a two-person operation called CAS Hewlett and Company, operating out of an office that was not, by any measure, equipped to conduct the kind of audit that a $7 billion bank's financial statements required. This fact alone, that the auditor of one of the world's larger offshore banks was a firm of two, tells a story about the sincerity with which the regulatory architecture of the fraud was constructed. The choice of auditor was not incidental. It was essential. An audit that cannot actually audit produces the certification of an audit without the substance. And that certification, that piece of paper with an official signature, is all that most investors will ever see. They will never examine the portfolio. They will never assess the liquidity. They will never travel to Antigua and sit in the offices of the Financial Services Regulatory Commission and ask the questions that the commission was nominally charged with asking on their behalf. They will see the certification and they will trust it, because the alternative of trusting nothing, of verifying independent, of treating every institutional credential as potentially fraudulent, is not a way that human beings can function in a complex financial world. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Stanford affair, and it is a lesson that offers no comfort. We have built financial systems of such complexity that individual investors cannot possibly evaluate the truth of what they are being offered. We have built regulatory systems to evaluate it on their behalf. And we have built, within and alongside those regulatory systems, the conditions that allow the regulatory systems to fail: political influence, jurisdictional ambiguity, resource constraints, the revolving door between public and private sectors, the structural incentives that favor inaction over enforcement. When the subject of investigation is wealthy and connected and presents himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never adequately been questioned. The light in Antigua falls on the empty offices and the sold compounds and the repurposed spaces without judgment. It has no memory of what happened here. It illuminates whatever is present with the same impartial abundance that it has always brought to this corner of the Caribbean. The sea continues its patient erasure of the shoreline, grain by grain, wave by wave, the same process by which all fixed things are eventually returned to motion. The story of what happened here, the $7 billion, the certificates of deposit, the fabricated statements, the failing oversight, the cricket in the case of banknotes and the knighthood and the collapse. That story has been told in courtrooms and in reports and in the careful, painful testimony of those who lost what they had built. It exists now as a record, as an artifact of a particular time and a particular configuration of opportunity and failure. It exists as evidence of what can be accomplished by a man willing to use the full vocabulary of legitimacy in the service of its opposite. And it exists as a question that the light cannot answer, a question about what we owe each other when we ask to be trusted with the savings of a lifetime, and what the world owes those who trusted and were betrayed.